Allen's Investigate, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans. Yay, and welcome to the Allen's Investigate with me, Shona Allen.
And I'm Gary Allen, the Cockney Bard.
We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans and also on Roku. Now, this week, we'd like to welcome a special guest, Gary Heseltine, former British police... I'll put my teeth back in. Former British police officer, editor of UFO Truth Magazine, creator of PRUFOS, which is the Police Reporting UFO Sightings database, UFO researcher and author. Welcome, Gary.
Welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for coming on. Yeah. So this is going to be really interesting. So we're going to be talking about your new book, which is called Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 Years of Denial. But before we do you think you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your own experiences in this, please?
Okay, quite a long, circuitous route to becoming a researcher. I'll simplify it. I had a childhood sighting when I was 16 years old. With my then girlfriend in Scunthorpe, my hometown in Lincolnshire, in the United Kingdom. And basically, I saw a large white light against a background of stars, much larger than the other stars, moving silently right to left. And it appeared to trigger a power cut in the area, like the whole grid went down.
Wow.
And it was slowly moving towards where I lived. And so I had my bicycle with me at the time, and I dropped my girlfriend off at her house, which was about 3/4 of a mile to a mile away from where I lived, and then raced like mad to try to catch up with this light that was moving very silently and slowly towards my home. As I got close to my home, there was a left-hand turn in the road, and I could see that the power, all the street lights and the house lights, was on at this bend. So as I got to the bend, I looked over my right shoulder and realized that I just managed to get in front of the object, which was now slightly behind me. I then went round 2 corners, dropped my bike outside, rushed into my parents to the living room and said, "Come outside. I think there's going to be a power cut caused by this strange light." They looked at me bemused, as you would, didn't move. So I ran out into the garden at the back and looked back towards my semi-detached house, just in time to see this large white light coming over my house. And instinctively, and I don't know why to this day, I put my hand up as if I'm answering a question in class. And as soon as the object went past, i.e. the 90 degrees of my arm, the whole area is plunged into darkness. The very precise moment. So how could I predict the power cut? So I realized then that whatever that light was must have interacted with the power grid, because I'd moved from a second geographical position about 3/4 of a mile, and it's ridiculous. I couldn't predict a power cut. So that's where my basic interest in the subject came from. Then kind of went away, had a life, a couple of kids, got married, joined the Air Force, spent 6 years in the Royal Air Force Police. 3 of those 6 years was working guarding nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons at 2 RAF bases, one RAF Honington in Suffolk, and the other one later was RAF Larbruck in what was then West Germany. Then left the police in 1989, left the RAF police in 1989, joined the British Transport Police in 1989, so a straightforward swap, and then had a 24-year career with the police, and the last 19 years I was a detective constable, not a high rank, but I enjoyed interviewing suspects, and I became an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses, and was cleared to work on all manner of serious inquiry, including murder, manslaughter and rape. So that's kind of my policing background. I didn't become an active UFO researcher publicly until January 2002, when I launched the police database that you mentioned in the introduction, PRUFOS, Reporting UFO Sightings. And that's because something compelled me to get involved. I'd read lots of books over the years, and something compelled me to get involved. Well, as a detective, it's not easy to like be a regular member of a club or anything like that, because your time is not your own. If there's a serious incident, work many long hours to try to solve it. So I came up with the idea of doing a police database, and on the strength of that, I got a lot of initial national media attention, because I was a serving police detective when I did this, which attracted a lot of attention. That then led me to public speaking, which I'd never done, but found that it came easy to me. And then in 2010, I was awarded the PRG Disclosure Award in Washington, D.C. by Steve Bassett, who is a US lobbyist to Congress and Senate on UFOs and trying to get disclosure. And unofficially, it's like the World Disclosure Award for my work with police officers. And after that, that elevated my position publicly, and I began to be asked to do lectures all around the world. And I now have lectured, I think, in 21, 22 countries on this subject. So I'm very, very lucky. 2013, I retired from the police 6 years early to launch my own online e-zine, UFO Truth Magazine. And that's every 2 months. It comes out as a PDF, goes around all around the world. I tried to get it in print, but the print costs were too exorbitant, so it wasn't viable. But yeah, so in a sense, I'm very lucky. Last June, I actually gave a lecture to the Brazilian Senate, the Brazilian Parliament, for want of a better phrase. That's the way they call it, like the American Senate and the American Congress. I was one of 9 speakers, only 2 foreign speakers to brief the Brazilian Senate. The other one was an American called Robert Salas, who was involved in a very famous UFO incident where he was underground when 10 nuclear missiles were shut down by a UFO, switched off. So yeah, so that's pretty much where we are now. And here I am, very lucky to do something I'm passionate about.
What did people think about what your story, what you was telling, Gary, your early experience of what you had?
Wherever I've gone, even in the media, because I was a former detective, I've always been treated pretty well by the press and media. So I'm lucky, really, because a lot of people aren't so lucky. But yeah, pretty much because I was a detective, nobody really took the mickey out of me, although they still do on the subject.
In case they got arrested.
Much less so now.
Well, how did your colleagues get on with this as well? Because I know, obviously, with the database, it is specifically for police officers. So, what did they think? What did they make of it all?
1-to-1, privately, a lot of them thought I was doing a very interesting thing. If you got them in a group situation, detectives are terrible for taking the mickey out of each other. So I was crazy. They respected me as a detective, but they all thought I was a bit nutty publicly. But as soon as you got them on their own 1-to-1 and you told them about some of the best military cases, they'd all say, "Yeah, that's really interesting. There must be something else."
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we find the same thing with the sort of paranormal world as well. When you talk about sort of ghosts and haunting and spirits and things, you often get this kind of laughing and joking about it. But actually, when the crowd disperses and you talk to somebody on their own, actually they say, well, funnily enough, I had my own experience. So often people kind of brush it off, because sometimes it's through fear. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's through fear of being ridiculed, isn't it?
Absolutely. When I created the database, and it's still true to this day, the biggest reason for people not coming forward is a perceived risk to their career if you're a police officer, and two, a fear of ridicule amongst your peers. It's less so now because in the last 5 years, since 2017, specifically when the New York Times published a front page article saying that there really were things flying around in the US airspace that were unknown. That's begun to change the stigma. But most people born after, 1953 have lived in a world of deliberate deception, because in 1953 the CIA commissioned a team of scientists to find a way to strip the fascination that the public, the US public, had for flying saucers, which was the term of the day. And they came up after 2 days, decided that on a debunking program that would be absolutely everything, whether it be a pilot, it would be debunked. If it was scientists, it would be debunked. Any member of the public, it would be debunked. And that's really where this stigma has come from. So anybody born after 1953, you've lived in a world where it's been a deliberate policy to play this thing down. But the reality is very different if you look at the best evidence.
That's right. I mean, it's the same with the term conspiracy theory as well, because often, again, just the very term itself, conspiracy theory, automatically sends people into hysterics. Oh, it's just a conspiracy theory. So it's a very useful tool for those that wish to try and suppress certain information to use, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that's largely created by the media, who I'm not a big fan of the media, really, because they create false narratives, and they label people like I'm labeled a believer just because I believe that some UFOs are probably extraterrestrial. Then they label me as a believer, or you're a non-believer, and they almost try to turn it into a religious kind of debate. You're a believer versus the non-believer, and that's totally ludicrous. And I, as a former detective with 30 years collective policing experience, I can only ever look at this subject through what I would say evidentialized things that would stand up in a court of law, in a hypothetical court of law. So, that's the way I look at the subject.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I find with the media in general and things that have been going on fairly recently in the last few years, that you can see a very definite divide. They're always, whether it be politics, race, gender, religion, whatever it is, there's a very specific thing going on where they're trying to divide people rather than join people together and actually say, well, let's be open-minded on it. Let's have a discussion on it.
Well, if you think about it, the media hold such a powerful position, the mainstream media, and there are really only 6 or 7 major world media corporations. And if they all say UFOs are rubbish, then you're only going to get a slant on the subject that trivializes it. Now, if 2 or 3 of those said, no, we think time is right to now take this more seriously, then it would start to change. And that is slowly happening at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is changing. Yeah, I think we're heading for a period of time now where the media are coming to heel, I think. So it's a good time to be alive.
I wish they'd come to heel quicker. That's my frustration.
Yeah.
Yeah, us too.
It's a bit like watching a kettle boil at the moment, isn't it?
It can be. But I mean, I don't know how much you know about UFOs in the last few years, but there have been some pretty amazing things that have happened legislative-wise in the United States. Are you aware of these changes?
No, I'm not. No.
Okay, well, let me just fill you in briefly. And it started, like I said, with a New York Times article on December the 16th, 2017. And basically, up until that time, the New York Times has been one of the most skeptical newspapers. It's equivalent to our British Times, so very top paper. And they'd never, they'd always trivialize the subject, but they printed this front page story that related details of a secret UFO program, which the Americans had been doing for several years, when supposedly nobody knew about it, and the Americans had said since 1969 that they didn't do any UFO research. So that was interesting. And then within a few days, a couple of very important videos, UFO videos, showing specific objects, very clear objects, were released. And then a third video came out, and they were all authenticated after about a year or so by the United States Navy and the Pentagon. So basically, once they were confirmed, these three videos taken by Navy pilots, US Navy pilots, of objects whizzing across the sky or across the ocean on top of the surface of the sea, just skimming over the surface really quick, their reactions of the pilots said you're dealing with something extremely odd. But those videos have become really the genie that's been let out the bottle, because for the first time in history, you had authenticated military videos, and they all showed specific objects. And so for the first time, the media could legitimately ask politicians, what is that that's skimming across that footage? And because there was no ambiguity, and it was taken by pilots, those three videos have gone on to assume great importance. Now, in 2021, legislation was passed at the end of the year, I think December 2021, where for the first time, the US intelligence services, of which there's about 12 different organizations, you think of the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, those kind of things, they were all mandated for the first time by law of the Congress to supply reports on it's called UAP now, unidentified aerial phenomena. So instead of UFO, it's UAP. That's the posh word now. And basically, they were mandated for the first time in their history to give reports to the Congress. Now, at the end of December 2022, further legislation was passed in the Congress, again mandating the US intelligence services to begin a process of looking at historical cases where potential whistleblowers, i.e. people who'd maybe worked on secret UFO programs, could be have their pensions protected, and they could come forward publicly to the Pentagon or an office called ARO, which stands for the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and they could give their accounts historically to Congress. Now, because of that, it's now anticipated that perhaps even this year, there will be probably military and pilot witness hearings live in the United States, like a congressional hearing, where these witnesses will finally, after 30, 40, 50 years, be able to reveal their stories to the Congress and also to the world, because it will be covered live. Now, that's going to be very interesting, because we know that some of the people involved, I mentioned a guy called Robert Salas, who I gave a presentation to and with in Brazil to the Senate in June of 2022, June of last year. And he was the man who was responsible for pressing the nuclear key and setting the missiles to nuclear Armageddon if there had been Soviet aggression. So we're talking 1967, he's 80 feet down in his military bunker, and he is in charge of 10 nuclear missiles, Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles, not easy to say. And one by one, he gets a phone call from his topside guard and says there's a UFO shining a beam down into the bunkers where he was 80 feet underneath, and then suddenly 10 nuclear weapons switched off one by one. And fail-safe systems, at least 2 or 3 fail-safe systems. So that was supposed to be pretty impossible. But the UFO shone a beam down into the bunker, switched off 10 nuclear weapons. Well, this has been suppressed from the mainstream media. So people within the UFO subject have known these very credible people, military witnesses. You can't get more credible than having your finger on the nuclear trigger and in terms of responsibility. So for his account to go public perhaps later this year in a congressional hearing, I think that's maybe when the press really will for the first time realize the depth of some of these classic cases historically.
It's interesting.
It is, yeah.
I mean, I came across a long time ago when I was sort of delving into it all, talk about the Nazis actually doing saucer projects. I mean, have you looked into that at all?
There is no two ways about it. The Germans were historically in the Second World War far in advance of both the Russians and the Americans technologically, and several shall we say circular aerial platforms were being worked on, but there's no real evidence to say that they went beyond the design stage and they never went into production, etc. They were still far and away, far and above the technology of the Americans, and hence why after the war so many of the German scientists went to work for the American space program in what was called Operation Paperclip.
Operation
Yeah,
Paperclip.
so I think there are stories of Nazi UFOs, and I think there may well have been one or two prototypes, but I certainly don't think it really went beyond that stage.
I know certainly Werner von Braun was sort of somebody who was very involved in that, and he went on to work for both NASA and Disney. Interestingly,
absolutely, and many people, if anybody knew that UFOs were real, as in extraterrestrial, Werner von Braun was almost certainly one of those people, because he was the top man for a long time, and so had he become aware of UFOs, he would have been certainly told and I think brought into that equation. And there are stories that he actually admitted that he had been briefed on UFOs. So it's hard to prove, but I think there's a good chance that he did know about UFOs and the Roswell crash from 1947 and things like that.
So it's quite interesting, because the reason I brought it up is because if you think about it, obviously, if they did manage to take this technology wherever it came from, because they were also delving quite deeply into the Vimanika Shastra, where they talk of the Vimana, these flying vehicles. So I know that the Nazis are very much looking at ancient technologies, trying to create things from that. So it's interesting. So where I was going with that, as under Operation Paperclip, it seems to me that obviously our military were also working on lift and flight and new technologies. So that's quite interesting that perhaps not all, I mean, some of the items obviously I think are probably beyond explanation and some people's experiences, but I think also in the equation is the fact that our military, I think, are extremely advanced, but obviously they can't necessarily share that with the public.
Yeah, no, I mean, the people talk about reverse engineering. If, for example, the Roswell crash from 1947, which was the alleged recovery of a crashed flying saucer and potentially some bodies as well, we're not certain, but I do believe the evidence points that something very unique did crash that was recovered. Now, if a machine, for example, had been recovered, then there is no two ways about it. The Americans would want to try to make it work. If it wasn't working, if it was broken, they'd try to fix it. And if it was so in advance, they would probably try to reverse engineer parts of it. And they would take it to part. And apparently the story goes that small parts were then given in small contained programs, special access programs, where they would go to the top engineering companies and say, we've got a piece of technology, we want you to try to make it work or expand on it, improve it. And these engineering companies were all working in private, unrelated to each other. They really didn't know. So I think that I think that's entirely plausible, because what they've always said is anybody that could recover and make that technology work for mankind would suddenly make this huge leap in technology, and thus the country that did that would become the most powerful nation on the earth. Well, at this moment in time, we kind of still think of America as the only true world superpower, although India and China might argue that now. But essentially, whichever country got that technology working would make this huge leap and make themselves pretty impregnable. And I think that's really something that any country would try to do, reverse engineer a recovered craft of high technology, because they would try to benefit militarily and potentially for the public as well. But I think for their first instinct would always be to turn it into a weapon, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll tell you what is interesting, Gary, is that when I was 19, I went to Benidorm, and it's the only experience I've ever had of what you call a flying saucer, because I, from the hotel room, I had someone gave me a pair of high-power binoculars. Why he had them, I don't know. But anyway, he had this pair of high-power binoculars, and I looked at this object, and you could clearly see the windows, and it was saucer-shaped, and it was going at such amazing speeds, shooting all over the place. And then it went behind a tower block, and it suddenly disappeared. 2 years, I don't know after that, but the stealth bomber came out, which which was pretty amazing. But whether that was, as I say, I'm open-minded on the subject, so I don't know what it was, whether it was a military black project or it was a UFO that the military didn't know about. I have no idea, but it was fantastic. And to have seen that was a great privilege anyway, whatever it was.
Yeah, I mean, if the way UFOs move, and the way I describe it is real UFOs, i.e. what I think is some of which are extraterrestrial. Only a small percentage, perhaps 3% of all cases reported, turn out to be unknown. But these unknown craft, they maneuver in ways that we don't. They make instant acceleration, instant stop. They do zigzags. They bounce around the sky like a ping pong ball. Well, we can't do that. So if you see anything like that, and I don't know if you did in Benidorm, then that is definitely not something that mankind can replicate aerodynamically.
Well, it was extraordinary, So I just think the way it was shooting about, and it was sort of, it was diagonal and backwards and forwards. It was extraordinary.
Well, that's not something that ordinary aircraft or helicopters can do.
No,
so it sounds like it's got a genuine.
I know nothing of a stealth bomber, so
well, I mean, here's the thing: people have likened it to stealth, and undoubtedly, some UFO sightings historically have been secret stealth aircraft. Yeah. However, all a stealth aircraft does is become radar invisible. It's less to track on radar. It still takes off on a runway. It still takes off on wheels. It still goes straight up. It can't zigzag around, go up and down, vertically, right-angled turns, reversals. It can't do that. It's still an aeroplane. So it has to land and go up to an altitude and come back down. So however stealthy it is, it just means it's radar invisible. So the movements of stealth really are nothing like genuine UFOs that I've seen.
Interesting. Well, moving on to Rendlesham Forest. For people that perhaps don't know that much about it, could you give us a sort of a précis about what happened, please?
I will. Suffice to say that in the book, I describe the Rendlesham Forest case as the most complicated UFO case in history. And I don't do that lightly. I do so because it's complicated with lots of moving parts. And what I mean by that is, ordinarily, a UFO sighting is one event. At such and such a time, so many witnesses see this. Well, Rendlesham Forest is not that. And in the conclusions to my book, which is that, there are 17 different timed UFO events over not just 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, I believe now 4 successive nights of UFO activity. So 17 events over a 4-day period, 4-night period, or 4-day period, however you want to look at it. And none of them can be explained away in rational man-made terms. You've got things that are seen like glowing beach balls, the size of a beach ball, but under control. You've got, on I now believe, 2 different landings of craft. The first one in a clearing in the forest, which was approximately 3 meters by 3 meters, a triangular black object at or near the ground. So basically 3 meters by 3 meters and 2 meters high, seen by multiple witnesses. And then a couple of nights later, 3 nights later, I now believe that there's a second landing, which is arguably more important, because in this second landing, 2 people corroborate now, military witnesses corroborate that there was a second landing. And the second landing sounds like something from Star Trek. Basically, a craft is surrounded by US Air Force security police. It's being filmed on at least one moving image camera, so not still pictures. We're talking about either cine film or early video. The base commander of 12,000 people, Colonel Gordon Williams, was present, along with a guy called Colonel Holt, who was the deputy base commander. Now, like I've said, prior to my writing this book, prior to 2017, the accepted story was that there were just 3 nights of activity, and there were really only 2 major incidents. But using my detective acumen skills, I've broken it down to different time events. I've talked to a lot of the military witnesses who've already gone on the record, re-interviewed them and got further sightings and new information. I've found new military witnesses. I also delved into historically little known interviews going right back to the early 80s. And of course, this event happened in December 1980. And largely, it didn't really become a world famous case until October of 1983. So for almost 3 years, it remained largely unknown to the greater masses. 1 or 2 people did know about it, but to the masses, it was pretty much unknown. And then a big News of the World tabloid article appeared on October the 2nd, saying UFO lands in Suffolk and it's official. And what was interesting about that, and what made it kind of go viral long before social media and viral, the term coming into effect, was that the newspaper article contained a reference to an American Air Force document that had just been released to researchers in early 1983. And the News of the World had got a copy of this document, and it was sensational because for almost 3 years, the US Air Force, despite lots of requests for information, had steadfastly denied having any knowledge of any incident in Rendlesham Forest. And then this document surfaces, and it wasn't really supposed to come out, and it's on headed US Air Force notepaper, and it's just a 1-page memo, but it's an explosive memo because it says that there'd been a landed triangular craft on one night, what's called the first night, and then 2 nights later, the deputy base commander, Charles Holt, had led a small team out into the forest, and he too had seen multiple UFOs while he was out 2 nights later. So this document was extraordinary because it finally confirmed that there had been at least 2 nights of UFO activity in the forest. And so that's why it became viral, not least because the document was signed by the deputy base commander of what was a nuclear base, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. So that elevated it from not just a minor document. In UFO terms, it's probably one of the top 10 major documents ever to be released worldwide because of the rank of the person who said, I saw multiple UFOs and signed it. So that's where we were. And then I did this really deep dive. And we can talk about specifics. If you ask me, I'll tell you some of the things that emerged and some of the cases that are just kind of mind-blowing, really.
Interesting. Yeah, please do, because I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm sure our audience would as well.
Well, bear in mind, I don't know how much your audience really knows about the subject, so I'll do it in simple terms.
Okay.
But one of the things that had been controversial was this story, an alleged story of a second landing. And prior to 2017, the original military whistleblower was a guy called Larry Warren, Airman Larry Warren. And he'd first gone public in late 1982, early 1983 with his story. And he was literally the first person to say, I am Larry Warren and I was a witness, and go on camera for the TV and things like that. So he took on the mantle of being the original military whistleblower. And he was on his own for about 8 years until about 1991. And then Colonel Holt, as was when he retired, the guy who'd written that memorandum, he retired in 1991. And as soon as he retired, he then began really to attack Larry Warren, saying it didn't happen. There was no other landing. There was no base commander there. It wasn't filmed. The talk of aliens was ridiculous, and immediately started attacking him. And then a couple of other witnesses soon retired. Jim Peniston in 1993, I believe it was, and then John Burroughs, another military witness, in 95. And so within 4 years, all three of them were kind of dismissing the original military whistleblower's case, saying it didn't happen, their recollections didn't match, blah, blah, blah. Well, one of the things that happened in the book was there was somebody who was a Lincoln witness who was supposed to have been with this military whistleblower, Larry Warren, in the field at this other landing. Well, this person was a bit like Walter Mitty. He was very hard to find. The Scarlet Pimpernel, he was very reluctant to speak publicly, and eventually I was able to speak to this witness, and he was a sergeant called Adrian Bustinza. And what was extraordinary was that I did a transatlantic phone call for 4.5 hours through the night in the UK. So I was extremely tired as it went on during the night. So basically we did a night shift doing this, and we had an extraordinary interview. And eventually he said that, yes, Larry Warren was there. So finally this airman was right all along. He said, yes, he was closer to the craft than I was. So that was important. He said that it had been surrounded by a cordon of US Air Force security police officers, that the base commander of 12,000 personnel, Gordon Williams, who steadfastly denied being there, he was there. Colonel Holt was there, and that it was all being filmed. Now, this was an extraordinary admission for him to make, so it finally corroborated the original military whistleblower, Larry Warren. Now, there'd been such controversy about that, but there he was. But the only thing that he said that was an entirely new surprise was he said, but that was on a different night. And I said, what did you mean it's a different night? He said, that was the second night I got involved in UFO activity. And it was the second night, not the first night. And that may have caused some of the confusion, because he was indicating that it was either a fourth night or had happened later than his earlier involvement. Okay, so think of it in simple terms as a fourth night instead of a third night. And that made sense, because over the years, one or two people, including myself, had thought there may well have been more nights of activity. Well, here we have this guy saying this. Now, there's a very interesting link in the book that backs this admission up by Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. And it actually comes from Colonel Holt himself, the guy who wrote the memo. And it came in the form of an admission that Colonel Holt had made to UFO researcher called Ray Boucher in 1985. So just 5 years after the incident. And what is significant here is that Colonel Holt was still serving in the Air Force. So we're talking 1985. Now he's well known in 50, 60 documentaries on Rendlesham, English-speaking documentaries. He's always there because he's an important witness, and he was a witness. But he is a public personality now, whereas in 1985, this was 6 years before he retired. So in a sense, this was before his public persona that it is now. So this researcher, an American guy called Ray Boucher, rang him up out of the blue and said, look, I've been doing some research into the Rendlesham Forest incident, and I've talked to a number of witnesses, including Larry Warren, including Adrian Bustinza. He'd already done an early interview. So, and he basically said, these people are saying that there was a security cordon. It happens in the field. There's another landed craft. The base commander's there, and that it's, you know, it's being filmed. And he said this to the researcher. And what's important is that he wrote the colonel's words down verbatim in his research notes. And he said, I can verify that. I can substantiate all of that for the senator. The senator being a guy called Senator James Heseltine, who Ray Boucher was trying to get more information and try to say there's an important case involving American servicemen. So this admission, 6 years before he became this public figure, is really pertinent. And as a former detective, it's a valid one because it was written down verbatim. And there's no ambiguity about what this researcher had told him, because subsequently he wrote letters to Senator James Heseltine, and he said, on such and such a day, I spoke to Colonel Charles Holt. I laid out the circumstances and said that there'd been another landing, that it'd been filmed, it was guarded by security police, and that the base commander was there. And he said this. So there was no ambiguity whatsoever. So people have tried to say, well, maybe he was, you know, it was ambiguous with his words, but they weren't. It was a definite word for word quote that he wrote down in his research. And that backs up now what Sergeant Adrian Bustinza said to me in this 4.5 hour call. So that is really, really important because it backs up what Adrian Bustinza was saying. So in effect, there's now 3 people that saying that event did happen, and that's a major thing that has been covered up for all of these years, because Colonel Holt, Colonel Williams denied that they'd been present at a second landing. Well, now we have the truth. There was a second landing, and they were present, and it was filmed. So where that video is a real question mark.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had a question. We had a question just come in as well from Kevin. I don't know whether. Here it comes. He said, I remember the original story breaking back in the day when I lived in London. I believe it was the first or only UFO incident mentioned in Parliament.
Not quite true. I think over the years there have been various parliamentary questions asked about important UFO cases, because historically cases used to be recorded at what was called the UFO reporting desk, in simple terms, UFO desk, and any sighting that the public had, pilots had, police officers had, were reported to the Ministry of Defence. And they and members of the public would go to their MPs and say, can you ask a question, blah, blah, blah. It's true to say that the Rendlesham Forest case has attracted probably more questions in Parliament than any other. And that is something that now the book is published, that I will be pursuing some MPs with regards to the book, because I want to try to see if I can get questions tabled in Parliament about this, because it's happened before. So yes, it's a good question, and yes, there have been a lot of questions about Rendlesham. And in light of the new evidence that's in the book, of which we've only just touched on a tiny bit, then I think more questions should be asked in Parliament.
Yeah, for sure. I think the thing is, as well, it's very interesting, and it's very difficult to try to separate fact from fiction in all this, because I find with when security forces and military, etc., are involved, deliberate red herrings are thrown in to try and muddy the water so that the truth is not actually ever found. So it's sometimes very difficult. So I think being in your position of having been a detective puts you in a fabulous position, really, to be able to try to decipher that which is truth and that which is fiction.
Yes, and all the you know, I sent the book out to lots of international UFO researchers, and fortunately all of them have come back saying it's a very analytical, done through forensic eyes as a detective, and that they say it should go on to become the definitive book on the case. That's their words, not mine. But suffice to say that they recognise that the evaluations that I do of lots of historical interviews, the way I interpret and question people, gives it more of an air of authenticity, and that's good. I still think there's lots of more witnesses out there, but there was a question that came up there about British police.
What was that?
Well, that was denied, but in the book, I actually proved that actually the British police were there, because not only did Larry Warren say the British police were there, the original military whistleblower, on one of the night, at least one of the nights of activity, Adrian Bustinza, this guy who had the 4.5 hour in transatlantic call, he said that he was present when a police vehicle turned up, a British police vehicle. And interestingly, there's an audio tape that Colonel Holt, the deputy base commander, had made on one of the nights, and it was like a live intermittent commentary of live UFO events, and it's become very famous, known as the Holt tape, audio tape, because he's describing live events as they happened, and that doesn't usually happen in many cases. Well, on one of the quirks of the book, I came across a document that was part of a transcript of that audio tape of people in the forest and talking amongst themselves, and it had been transcribed, and the page was had been annotated by an American investigative journalist called Chuck DeCaro, and he worked for CNN, Cable News Network. And in 1985, they did a very good documentary. It was one of the, probably arguably the first and best, still to this day, documentary on the Rendlesham case, as it was known in 1985. And many military witnesses appeared in shadow, but they went on camera, which was important. But what was interesting is that in this single page of annotated notes on the script, the transcript, it went B bar at a certain point in brackets. And for those of you who are not aware, that American sirens in 1985 went woo, woo, woo. It's a good impression, that, really, wasn't it? And the British police, their sirens went me ma, because we weren't as good. We didn't have as nice a vehicle. Yeah. So basically, the fact that in that part of the transcript that he'd written B bar, and I thought, well, I've never heard that before. But anyway, I got hold of eventually found a really good audio copy of the whole transcript and the audio tape, and sure enough, exactly where it said B bar, it came on. And so that meant that a British police vehicle had turned up in the forest, and it with its signs going B bar. Now, when I asked Sergeant Adrian Bustinza about this, he said it had a siren on. It turned up at what's called the staging area. Now, the staging area in the forest plays quite an important part on several of the nights, because it was the furthest you could go in the forest before you had to get out and go on foot. So basically, you went off into the forest, the road came to an end, everybody parked up, and you had to go out on foot further into the forest. And so lots of vehicles were there on many of the different nights. Well, he's saying that on at least one of the nights he's involved, he sees this British police vehicle turn up. This has always been denied by the likes of Colonel Holt, Colonel Williams, the Deputy Base Commander, and the Base Commander. So it's important now that we clarify that the British police did turn up, not only in an audio, but also backed up by Larry Warren and Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. Another little thing historically that we can nail down. So what it's pointing down to, and as the book makes it clear, is that the narrative of the Rendlesham Forest case, this very famous case that some people would regard as the second most important UFO case in history, not just in British history, world history, the most second important case after Roswell, this 1947 alleged crash of a UFO. So here it is. So it's an exalted company. And here we are having this information that there's several landings, that entities are seen at one point on at least 2 occasions. We can talk about that down the line. But I thought what you might like is a real revelation that came out in the book through talking to another military witness.
Okay.
And this is I guess what I'm saying is that the narrative that we have been presented in the media in these 50 or 60 documentaries, in a sense, has been controlled, because the same people appear each time as military witnesses, and very few other military witnesses get a chance to go on there. Or if they come forward, they're generally attacked by 3 principal witnesses, which makes it complicated. And you've got to think, well, why are they attacking them? And I think the real reason is because they wanted to play down the significance of these other cases, especially this second landing. But one of the cases that is really important and has been totally covered up for nearly 43 years is an incident involving a young shift commander, female shift commander, one of the 4 shifts. She was one of the shift commanders in charge of a shift of approximately 35, 40 personnel. And her name was Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. And she was highly thought of. And we'd known prior to 2017 that something really dramatic had happened to her, because several witnesses heard her over the radio on one of the nights of the UFO activity, screaming over the radio, "Help, help, help, Bobby, Bobby, help, help," that kind of thing came over the radio. And we knew that something was so distressing that she went off sick, she went off shifts, she was ill. But we really didn't know much more than that. And in talking to a military witness called Michael Stacey Smith, who'd had an earlier encounter himself in July of 1980, so a few months before, he made an off-the-cuff remark about Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, and they knew a bit about her story. Well, cutting a long story short, what he told me was literally the missing pieces of the jigsaw. And what happened was that somebody, a woman, an airwoman, now that even though they're an airwoman, in 1980 they were still called airmen, which I guess isn't politically correct, but that's as it was. But airman, Laurie Bowen, who was a female airman, which is complicated, she reported seeing a flaming ball of light drop into the forest, and she reported it to the control, the Central Security Control. Cut long story short, the first person who was able to respond to this strange incident was Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, who just happened to be on mobile patrol going on a rural British country road from the back of RAF Bentwaters. It was a twin base US complex. So if you think of RAF Bentwaters, and then it's separated by Rendlesham Forest, and then you come to RAF Woodbridge. Well, she was on this British public road. Well, what we now know is the missing pieces. And the missing pieces is this. Michael Stacey Smith was at RAF Bentwaters when he is suddenly told, go to the back gate, which is called the Butley Gate, go to the back gate and open it up because some vehicles, police vehicles, are going to be going out there soon. So it's all kind of done urgently. He gets down, he opens the gate, and sure enough, 3 or 4 US Air Force security police vehicles rush out in a convoy. He doesn't know what's happening, but there's obviously a panic on for some reason. And then about 10 or 15 minutes later, he then sees one of these 4 vehicles return back to where he is at this back gate. And the front seat passenger is Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. And she is without her beret. She is disheveled. She is shaking, crying uncontrollably. He doesn't get to speak to her, but she's then brought in. And the person who's driving the vehicle is Sergeant Robert Ball, which ties into what we'd heard about Bobby, as in Robert Ball, Sergeant Bobby Ball. And so if they go in, it still doesn't
Did he have a friend called Cannon?
I knew you were going to say that, but I was just waiting for it. But this is a crazy thing, is then about 10 minutes after that, a second vehicle then comes to the back gate to go into the base. And this time he notices that the vehicle has sustained vehicle damage, i.e. its roof has been crumpled slightly, as if it's been rolled and turned over into a ditch or something like that. Mm-hmm. He still doesn't know what's what, but in that vehicle, it's still drivable. It comes in. And then he goes to see a sergeant that he was friends with and says, what's happened? Clearly something distressing has happened to Bonnie Tamplin. What's happened? And he says, if I tell you, you must promise me never to reveal my name. And he said, I swear to you, I'll never reveal it. And he didn't reveal it to me either. But I've no reason to disbelieve Michael Stacey Smith's account. He gains nothing by lying. And what he said was, the sergeant told him that as Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin had been driving on the rural British country road between the 2 bases, a glowing red beach ball sized object had started to fly alongside her at hedgerow height. So can you imagine, you're driving away and then suddenly you look out the window and there is this red ball following you, like seemingly under control. She was so frightened that she lost control of the vehicle and she rolled the vehicle into a ditch. However, it doesn't end there, because when she climbed out of the vehicle, fortunately wasn't too hurt, but she climbed out, this glowing object is stationary looking down at her. So it's like waiting for her. And as she gets out, she is so frightened by this that she gets her weapon and starts shooting at it, firing off several rounds, which then makes the object disappear in the blink of an eye at speed. Now, for anyone to go through that experience would be traumatic enough. To have to get to climb out of a rolled vehicle and then find that the object is menacingly looking down at you. No wonder she fired. No wonder she was traumatized. And that's what happened. But here's the thing. All of this incident to this day has been covered up by the US Air Force, who recovered a weapon, recovered a vehicle, recovered the rounds and put them into the armory to say that, you know, nothing had happened. There was no written record of this incident. And you imagine, this should be a front page story. A young officer was run off the road on a British public road by a UFO, and she discharged a weapon at it. It's an incredible tale. But
what happened to the lady? Sorry, Gary, what happened to the lady?
We don't really know. To suffice to say that within a few days, she was being shipped back to the United States, and she's never gone public with her account. I know that she lives in Europe. She married a European. I know I've traced some of her family and tried to get them to get messages to her, but she clearly doesn't want to respond because this, and who can blame her? This is so traumatizing. But I kind of hope that one day, because everybody's getting older now, that she may want to go on the record, and if she does, she gets it, realizes the book's out there, and that I'm appealing for lots more witnesses who have yet to come forward to contact me, because I'm convinced there's many more. But that's a pretty sensational story, and that that was released in the press, but it wasn't front page story. But and the national media have covered it in 4 or 5 newspapers in recent weeks. But it should be front page story now. Another incredible piece of information that was confirmed if you want me to go on, or do you want to ask?
Yes,
Yeah,
please,
sure.
please do.
Another guy that came forward was another American witness, was a guy called Steve Longero. And his story is pretty amazing as well, because there had long been rumors prior to my reinvestigation that a UFO had shone a beam down into the nuclear weapons storage area, i.e., as into scanning the nuclear bunkers to see what was inside. Well, we'd never had a name to that before. It was just rumors. Well, Steve Longero contacts me, and he, cut a long story short, he basically said, I had just arrived on the base and just new onto shift, and I was working alongside an experienced airman walking around inside the nuclear weapons storage area. It's a small area that contains tactical nuclear weapons that were hidden underground, and they were supposed to be there. It was a nuclear base. So he's inside walking around with an experienced airman. They've got their machine, their rifle or whatever, and they're walking around inside. When he sees a UFO near to the forest, and it then begins to shine a beam down into what was called the hot row. The hot row was a row of nuclear hardened bunkers. So concrete bunkers with big metal doors, and they had underground facilities. And basically, he said that this object shone a beam akin to a laser beam, and it did this. And it went all the way down the weapons storage area. So one end of the street, if you think of it as one long street and buildings, it went all the way down in a pendulum fashion, checking all, as if it was scanning all of the bunkers to see what was there. So that was a named person. So again, another thing that we've put to bed now. So he's inside, and his name's Steve Longero. But it didn't end there, because what he also said was that as the object switched off the beam, it then began to move over towards Rendlesham Forest, which wasn't too far away. And he heard on the radio that people were tracking this object as it moved towards the forest. And because there was kind of like a panic on ensuing, something is happening, strange objects being seen, he was then taken off the weapons storage area, which would be very unusual usually, but because he was supernumerary and he was just being shadowing an experienced airman, they took him off for an extra body, as it were, manpower, to go into the forest, because strange things were happening in the forest. So he had that sighting, first of all, on the weapons storage area, and then he is transported in a truck into the forest to this staging area where they can't go anymore, and then they're out on foot. And he said that he was then taken by other American security police to what was classed as the initial first night landing site. And when they were shown these depressions in the ground, there were three equilateral triangle depressions in the ground, each consistent of each other, about 9 to 10 inches, about 1.5 inches in depth. So as if something evenly had put weight down into the forest. Well, when he got out there, he then was around with another 10 or 15 other US security police officers when he has a second UFO sighting, and all these people witnesses. Now, nobody had ever heard of this sighting. So this is yet another sighting that was totally unknown prior to doing the book. So you can see that there's a lot of information that's come to me over the 5-year reinvestigation and 3 years writing the book. And it's just sensational stuff. And there is no reason for these people to lie whatsoever. And an interesting quirk was that Steve Longero had joined the Air Force at a pretty similar time to the original military whistleblower, a guy called Larry Warren. This guy who'd been really trivialized for many years by Colonel Holt, Colonel Williams, and other military witnesses, and now finally corroborated and proved by Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. And he said, well, I knew Larry Warren. I said, what do you mean you knew Larry? He said, well, we were on the same training course at Lackland Air Force Base. And he says, I saw him when I was out in the forest. I saw Larry Warren. So he was definitely there on one of the nights. And this is yet again another great piece of corroboration that when he was out in the forest, he said, I saw Larry Warren. And I said, oh, you know, this is a great piece of memory trigger, because you'd shared the same training course. He wasn't big friends with him, but like when I joined the Royal Air Force Police, I was one of an intake, a flight of 47 other people, 46 other people on my course. I only got to know 6 or 7 of them, got really close with people that are immediately in your block where you sleep, you go to the pub with or whatever. But you'd know the names by the end of your training phase of all of them. Because you'd recognize them. So when he went into the forest, having already seen a UFO over the weapons storage area, he sees Larry Warren and he's thinking, thank God I recognized somebody. And that would make sense. Great recognition factor, because they'd been on the same training course. And it's like, what the hell's going on? You know, keep your head down. And that's, I'm sure, what both of them were thinking. What the hell's going on? And they're just find themselves in the forest. So it would be great recognition factor. But they weren't big friends, but he did know him. So again, this is another great piece of corroboration.
It certainly is. And just to interject for people that might be just joining us, we're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also on Roku. So sorry to interrupt you there, Gary, but it's very interesting. So it seems to me that, do you think perhaps some of the military personnel have basically been told to deny everything? Deny, as sometimes these things seem to happen?
I think there are agendas at play. Some maybe individually, some collectively, but there is no two ways about it that I believe that the US Air Force, the US government, the British Ministry of Defence and the British government have done their damnedest to downplay the significance of what occurred at Rendlesham Forest. I mean, let me give you an example. I do lots of transcripts of old interviews, little or none interviews with military witnesses. And most people, probably 90% of the people who read the book, will be oblivious that these even existed. So I really delved down and got some really important old interviews and transcribed them so you can read them yourself. But there are times when the witness information was totally unknown. So when you find these old interviews, they're like gold dust, and they play a part. And I've done that a lot, and a lot of people are saying that that's one of the strengths of the book, is the fact that I go into minutiae, but I only keep the bits that I think you, the public, want to know. And there are so many interesting interviews that the vast majority of the public will not be aware of. So I think it's important that that is one of the things. I mean, there is just a wealth of material that a lot of people didn't know. I mean, one of the things that, again, involving Colonel Holt, that then at the time of the incident was the deputy base commander, is when, again, I refer back to the earlier admission that he'd made to this American researcher called Ray Boucher in 1985, which I think is a genuine admission and should be held up as an admission. Now, earlier, 2 years earlier, I came across information in my historical research that proved by 4 different sources that Colonel Holt had tried to sell his story to the News of the World. And this is the guy who's the deputy base commander who'd written that very famous memorandum. Now, I'd never heard of this, but I found 4 sources. And one of them, there was a really skeptical source, who was an astronomer called Ian Ridpan. But these 4 sources confirmed that prior to the story hitting the major world headlines in October of 1983, Colonel Holt prior to that, had been negotiating to sell his story at some point in the future to the same News of the World reporter who broke the big headline story, a guy called Keith Beebe. So this is really important. And again, it highlights the fact that prior to his retirement, which wasn't until 1991, four sources clearly said that he was trying to sell his story for X amount of money, probably a lot of money, but I don't know how much.
Yeah.
But the point was, these four sources proved that it happened. And the best one was by this skeptical astronomer called Ian Ridpath. And Ian Ridpath is famous in the Rendlesham story because he was largely responsible for putting forward the idea that some of the men had been fooled by the light from the Orford Ness Lighthouse. And amazingly, he was the guy who was given real prominence by the BBC, who did a famous film sequence where the lighthouse flashed every 5 seconds, blip. And they did a bit of filming at night. And this is where TV can be deceptive. And I believe this was deliberately deceptive to try to minimize what was going on. So Ian Ridpath says, well, when we match the audio tape with the flashing of the lighthouse every 5 seconds, you'll see on the tape that it matches exactly. Blip. There you go. It's the people in the audio tape are mentioning it. And for about 10 or 15 seconds, it works. And that's all you get to hear. Now, had it carried on for another 10 or 15 seconds, it would have been out of sequence. But for that little 15 seconds, the BBC were incredibly clever because they invited the public to realise that, oh, the airmen, of course, they've all been mistaken by the lighthouse. Oh, silly airmen. It was ludicrous from the beginning.
Sorry, I was just going to say, my dad was in the RAF and he was in aerial reconnaissance. So he'd be able to, I think that's what you call it, where you spot the aircraft.
Yeah.
So that was his particular skill. And so you can't tell me that they're going to be some very experienced air people there. They're not going to be able to tell the difference between a lighthouse or a comet or an actual flying craft.
Absolutely, especially one that's next to your feet, 2 feet away from you. But here's the sad thing, is that BBC clip, in a sense, in 1983, went viral. And that has caused, historically, so much disinformation. It was ludicrous from the start. Colonel Holt, when he wrote the memo, when it came out, he said, lighthouses don't fly, they don't go through trees, they don't shine beams down at your feet from above, and historically speaking as well, the actual lighthouse, which was dismantled a couple of years ago because of receding, basically became unstable because it was next to the sea with erosion. But basically, that lighthouse did not reflect a beam in a casting beam, like you see a big sweep of arc going inland. It didn't do that. It had a metal plato. So the sweeping arc only went out towards sea for obvious reasons, so it would alert shipping traffic. But you would see a blip of light every 5 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blip. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blip. Now, the BBC gave that little clip went viral, and it then became a staple part of every documentary made ever since, i.e. 50 or 60 worldwide English-speaking documentaries made ever since, still, to this day, still talk about it may have been the lighthouse.
I think it's funny. It is, exactly. And it's interesting as well, because if you do a cursory glance over the internet, you'll find such entries as Wikipedia, etc., where they're basically trying to brush it all aside by saying, well, from a skeptical point of view, You know, they talk about the Orford Ness Lighthouse and the 5-second thing. They said about the landing marks. Well, the police came and, you know, they didn't find anything, and they thought that the landing marks were nothing but rabbit burrowings.
Well, the truth on, you see, the truth on that, it was distorted as well, is because the three ground impressions that were made and found after the first night landing were identical, and they were in hard ground in a small clearing, equilateral triangle, 9 inches or so in diameter, 1.5 inches in depth, all consistent with the same weight going down. Now, the story of the rabbit marks is from twofold. One is the British police did attend the next day. That is not in doubt. They turn up and they go to the site, the landing site, but their witnesses are with Captain Mike Verano and other US Air Force security personnel when the British police look at these marks. And the real story, and it's been noted and quoted by several military witnesses, is that when the British police officer was asked, "What are you going to write in your police notebook?" he said, "Well, if you think I'm going to put flying saucers have done this, you can think again."
Yes.
because he didn't want to get ridiculed. And of course, it was a time when people were still being stigmatized and ridiculed. So he said, "I ain't going to put flying saucers have done these indentations." And the US Air Force security personnel who were there went, you know, whatever. But it was, that's the context. And this is what I say in the early part of the book, that context is everything. And so that's the context. So there was real bona fide reasons why that police officer was not going to report the truth. And so therefore, he basically said it could have been made by rabbit droppings or something like that, you know, scurrying animals. The other part that goes into disinformation that went with the lighthouse theory was a forester, a young forester called Vince Thurkettle, visited the initial landing site 6 weeks after the event. And he said 6 weeks later, when it's been trampled upon, destroyed by so many people who've gone into the forest, it did not look pristine, put it that way. He said, "Oh yeah, it could have been done by scurrying rabbits, you know, and things like that. It doesn't look like a landing site to me." But the fact that they were in a perfect equilateral triangle, that plaster casts were taken that were of the same depth and same size. Well, I mean, we talk about come dancing, but have we got a formation team of rabbits that were come dancing for rabbits? Because that's how ludicrous. But the reality is that the British media, and this is the serious point, jumped upon the rabbit markings and also the flash of the lighthouse. It's the lighthouse, and they were entirely created by the media. The British media entirely created that, and it's still with us to this day. It's a disgrace, but that's so they've
done a very good, effective job, haven't they?
Sorry?
I said they've done a very good, effective job, haven't they?
They have done an incredibly good job at disinformation.
Yeah.
And if the public, if this were like now on the BBC, and I was now speaking to millions of people, and we were having this all on the BBC, people would be amazed at how much genuine military information there is, because they have been given totally the wrong information through disinformation, i.e. the lighthouse, i.e. the marks on the ground could be explained. They couldn't, and this is really a serious point, and one of the reasons why I'm very anti the media at times, because they have been largely responsible for creating all of this disinformation.
Exactly. And Kevin has also come up with a comment as well. He said, "Gary, do you remember the swamp gas explanation for the incident? I think that was put forward in 2008.
Well, I don't think swamp gas explanation really worked with Rendlesham, but what you've had is some. Put it this way: if I want to get my book and information out there, it doesn't go around the world and go viral. You'll get the odd newspaper covering it like it's had. However, if I was a skeptic and I was putting a ludicrous skeptical theory, my story would go viral.
Yeah.
Now
exactly.
that's strange. It doesn't work in reverse. So it's like the truth is being suppressed and will be only talked up a little. But if you are a skeptic and you want to dismantle this case, you can fly and it go viral. And one of the times that was really weird was there was a former military US security police officer called Kevin Conn, and he said that he drove an old police vehicle with its sirens on through the forest, and that's what had deceived everybody. Well, we're talking literally maybe 60, 80, 100 US Air Force security police officers that were involved, and we're all deceived by this old police car that the base commander deceived. I mean, but that story went worldwide, and it still gets talked about.
Yeah.
You know, the swamp gas story is famous for an American case in the 1960s where J. Allen Hynek, who was this famous scientist who was attached to Project Blue Book, had described and it didn't do his career any good, but basically he came up with an explanation for some lights that had been seen and said it was swamp gas. And it was so ludicrous that he absolutely got hammered in the press. But I don't think that's been really mentioned in relation to Rendlesham. But yes, I kind of know what the questioner was on about. But yeah, so many implausible theories have been put out there. I mean, people talk about, oh, it was holograms. Was it? Well, where's the evidence that it's holograms? Oh, in 1980, holograms were virtually not even in existence. And yet we're trying to say that 17 different timed incidents were holograms projected, and everybody got it wrong. Well, people were carrying live arms. Some of the people shouldn't have had live weapons when they went in the forest. The majority were taken back. However, we know that some people, like Lieutenant Tamplin, had a weapon on a UK public road and she fired at the object. So when we talk about that, there are clearly some weapons that are out in the forest. And like there's been various references to sidearms that were out in the forest, and one or two people had other weapons. So I have no doubt whatsoever that some weapons were carried. But that should not impact on the fact that all of these things add up to a big cover-up, and that the media have been largely responsible for downplaying this. Now, I think, and I can't prove, but in the conclusions of the book, that the reason why there was a cover-up was because it was such a dynamite case. So many strange things were happening. And it could have been a game changer. Even in 1980, it could have been a real cause célèbre, as it were, like Roswell, and they wanted to play it down. So they had to come up with skeptical things to confuse the public. That's classic disinformation. Attack the witnesses, say they're all confused. Oh, yes, they're all sincere, but they were mistaken. Or it was an aircraft in a satellite breaking up in re-entry, none of which fitted the actual witness account. I mean, how do you say that something's in front of you 10 feet away and say that that's a re-entry of a satellite? People have said, oh, it was an East German secret probe. Well, if there'd have been one incident on one night, you might have had a good case. But not when we're talking 17 different incidents involving a multitude of different shaped objects over 4 days now. So it doesn't make sense. But nobody in the media really want you, the public, to know. And so, like with my book, I did no pre-publicity whatsoever. I literally released it on Amazon, and it's still on Amazon. It's the only place you can get it. And I slipped it out, didn't tell anybody, no pre-publicity, because I wanted the public to get the truth. And I figured that if I just release it without any pre-publicity, the information's then out there, it's live, and people can order the book, and that's what they've done in there. You know, a lot of people are now reading the book. Hundreds of be solved. So basically, you've got that information that's out there, and effectively, like with the US Air Force videos that came out that were authenticated, that information has come out now, and so the genie is out the bottle. And that means that the people who are trying to control the narrative have much less chance to try to control the narrative.
For sure.
And so what I'm trying to do is say, look, the way the case is presented in all the documentaries is fundamentally flawed. There are a lot more witnesses. A lot more witnesses have come forward to me. They should be in these documentaries now. Not that I should be, but these military witnesses deserve to have their voices heard, and they're not given a chance because only three or four people are controlling those documentaries and which people get picked for them. And it's wrong.
Yeah,
so the book is trying to change the narrative. And that's what I think is important, because you've been lied to. The media in both the US and the UK particularly deceived you. The government's deceived you. There should be questions about all these new revelations in Parliament. And I will be seeking to go down that line via my own MP, etc., in due course. But at this stage, with the book coming out in a couple of months, I'm trying to get as much of the information out there to get people on podcasts like this. So that's why I'm very grateful that you're giving me this opportunity to talk about it. Because the more we talk about it, the less the people who want to control the narrative can keep controlling it.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's
right. The thing is, there's a saying, isn't there? I think the lie travels halfway around the world. And the truth doesn't even have a chance to put its pants on, you know.
Absolutely.
This is exactly what they're doing, and you're seeing it now. This is all going on now with the politics and things.
Absolutely.
You know, that you're only seeing exactly. You're only seeing very carefully crafted pieces of what certain parties wish to present you with. That's the narrative they want to present you. So when you're watching the news, for example, you're not necessarily seeing the truth at all. You're seeing what they want you to see and what they want you to believe with their narrative. And this is the problem. And what this happens a lot as well with all of these things, with these stories that go out, is that they put the most ludicrous, stupid things out, including some of the most idiotic people out there to just discredit the truth, so that your average public, when they're watching the television, just thinks, oh, there's a nutter, you know, I'm not going to believe that.
Absolutely. That is classic, and you're really right to highlight that. I've worked on lots of TV documentaries, and they're pretty much all the same in terms of UFO documentaries. And what they do is they don't lie per se. What they do is they give you some of the information of the case, but not all the information. And this is the same for the news media. They do that on any politics, on any story. They give you a version. They don't lie. They give you some of the facts, but they don't give you all of the facts on which to make your full assessment, as it were. And so what I learned over many years, 20 years of making documentaries, is that the TV industries and the documentary industry makes entertainment. TV is entertainment. They make entertainment programs. They don't lie as such, but they give you only some of the information. And that's carefully controlled. So you only get a slant, a spin of their particular narrative. And that's the problem. And you can virtually adapt that to any subject, whether it be politics, religion. It's all slanted in a certain way. So they don't lie as such. They do it by omission. They just don't give you all the information.
Well, that was the idea of the Allens Investigate, Gary, because we wanted to let people get their side of the story over and get as much of it over. That's why we're not trying to interrupt you too much, because people need to hear your story. You know, if they believe you, they do, and if they don't, they don't. But at least you got your story out, haven't you?
Absolutely. I mean, the main thing that I'm trying to do is get the story of these other military witnesses to have a voice. It's not about me. It's about trying to give them a voice, that these other people deserve to have their sightings put on film, their accounts in documentaries, and they're not at the moment. And generally, an Inuit witness that comes forward is attacked by 3 or 4 people, one of them being the former Ministry of Defence official, Nick Pope, who was the world's go-to guy for documentaries. And yet there's a chapter in my book on him because he overplayed his role. He said he ran the UFO department. Well, he didn't. And I show the documents that prove that. He was only 24 when he joined the Ministry of Defence UFO desk. So nobody runs a Ministry of Defence department at the tender age of 24. He was in a one-person office, his own. He was a junior desk clerk, a desk officer. He was the lowest of the low. And no disrespect, in letters that he wrote to people during his time at the desk for 3 years, so between the ages of 24 and 26, he actually wrote letters to people basically repeating the UFO line, the dogma of the Ministry of Defence, that nothing so far has been of defence significance. Ludicrous, 17 different things flying around in the airspace in Rendlesham, but it's of no defence significance. It's a nuclear base, the top strike base in the UK at the time.
That's the minor thing.
Ridiculous. But going back to Nick Pope actually in a letter to another researcher during his time at the desk, not long before he moved on to another department, he said that his salary was only made up of 20% for UFO duties. Well, if we think of a simple terms of a 40-hour week, that means 1 day a week, 8 hours, 20%, 8 hours a week, he answered UFO correspondence, which was largely mundane. He may have looked at potentially 700 or 800 cases during his 3 years, but of which 90% of which were not worth the paper they were written on. They were poorly completed pro formas. And he maybe looked at a few police cases, pilot cases. He was never a trained investigator. He never went out the office. He never visited and took statements. He was never an investigator, but he's become, I believe, a millionaire at the top
he's always
of
wheeled out
the world in every documentary. But it's built on him saying he ran the UFO department. He didn't. I've got him in documentaries where he said, if you actually go to his website, even now, in his page, it says, I ran the UFO department. Well, I'm sorry, I couldn't do that. That's a misnomer. That's not correct. But good luck to him if he's become very well known. But it was built on an actual lie.
Yeah, it's interesting that. I was going to also mention that curiously, there are a number of these kind of nuclear installations and USAF basically on in the vicinity. So you've got RAF Bentwaters, you've got RAF Woodbridge, you've got Mildenhall actually was only between 40 and 42 miles away, and the same with RAF Lakenheath. Now they're all USAF places at the time. You've also got the Sizewell nuclear plant also, which is not that far away. So how curious it is that we have these kind of hotspot incidents in this vicinity.
Well, no, it's a good, well done. There were lots of US Air Force bases nearby. Not all of them had nuclear weapons, but there is a document that I came across that's listed in the book, referenced in the book, which did have Bentwaters down for, I think, 25 nuclear weapons. Now, here's an interesting thing. I had a 7-year collaboration period with Colonel Holt, the guy who wrote this famous memorandum, between 2007 and late 2014. And basically, he told me on the first night that we met, which is in 2007 for a documentary, I think it was for the History Channel, that he told me there were more nuclear weapons stored at Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. And that's key. He told me it twice, but let's stick with that. Now, a lot of people speculate, well, why do UFOs turn up at this base? Well, the book also reveals that there'd been several incidents. We now know that there was a major incident in late December 1979 because a new witness called James Stewart, it's all in the book, comes forward, sensational account. And then there were 3 what I call precursor cases that happened in early 1980. So you had one important UFO case in February 1980 at the bases. then in July, and then in November. So you've got all these leading up to then this cluster. So this is not a one-off, again, which the public and the media would like you to believe that this was just an isolated series of events. It wasn't. These have been ongoing. Now, why do they keep turning up? Well, what a lot of people don't realize, that in December 1980, the world was potentially on the brink of a third world war. That sounds quite extreme, but in reality, it's not, because there were hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops still under the Cold War, Soviet era. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the borders of Poland. Now, Poland at the time, if you go back to your history and you're old enough, Lech Wałęsa was the leader of the Polish shipyard workers. He went on to later become the president. But at that time, there was an uprising in Poland. They wanted democracy. Yeah. Well, if you know your history of the Soviet Union, they had rolled tanks in to quell uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and stamped on them with might, military might. And so at the time of the Rendlesham Forest cluster of incidents at the end of December 1980, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the Polish borders, and it did look like they were going to roll into Poland. And then there was another thing happening that was the powder keg of the Middle East, which is always a powder keg, but in particular it was inflamed at that time. And a lot of people just don't realize this and set the significance in the background, is that there were 52 Americans being held hostage by the Iranians. So it was the Iranian-American hostage crisis. So that was setting the Middle East on fire, as it were. So you had these two powder kegs going on at the same time. And then you wonder whether UFOs turn up. Why? Because perhaps there were far more nuclear weapons hidden underground at RAF Bentwaters, as what Holt had told me, than anywhere else in Europe. Far more than the 25 they were supposed to have. Maybe they had 525. I don't know. But I think, personally, can't prove it, but I think that UFOs turn up en masse late December 1980 as like a nuclear inspection. And the beams that were sent down into the weapons storage area, you remember what Steve Longero said? It's scanning the underground contents. And it's not proven yet, but it's alleged that at least several nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, were then removed from the base, perhaps having been affected by the beams, but they were taken away. Not absolutely nailed on, but makes sense given what had happened, that some of the ordnance have been affected. So that's why I think nuclear weapons, and if people aren't aware of this, is that there's a huge correlation. If people aren't really familiar with the UFO story, there's a huge correlation historically between UFOs being seen near nuclear bases, nuclear power plants, nuclear aircraft carriers, etc. They seem to be interested in nuclear weapons. We don't know why that is, but this goes back to the 1940s, really, when the development of the atomic bomb. And here's an interesting thing. People, when we talk about Roswell, it was Roswell, New Mexico, which in 1947 was pretty much the middle of nowhere. There was a US Air Force base there. But what made Roswell interesting to UFOs? Well, I always kind of liken it is to this. Imagine you've got one of those big globes, drinks globes, that you can spin around, that you've got in your nice house. A nice globe of the earth, and you can spin it around. Well, imagine trying to get a dart, as in playing darts, and you spin the globe, and then you say, I'm going to try to hit Roswell. And you go, boom. And of course, you don't hit Roswell. It's ludicrous. However, why do UFOs turn up at Roswell? Well, there's a good reason why. Because it was the world's first atomic bomb squadron.
Yeah.
Now, when you put it in that context, then it shows that even then, UFOs were attracted to atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. And why, we're not sure, but that's no coincidence. The world's only atomic bomb squadron was Roswell, New Mexico.
Yeah, it's
Interesting.
very
Once they
interesting.
put it in those terms, and they should, because that gives it context. And this is
Yeah.
what I say, that the book is about the context, and I give you the context in a way that you've not been shown it before. And I evaluate all these old interviews, the new interviews that I've done. I'm only skimming the surface of what's in the book, but believe me, there is a lot of new material, and the vast majority of people who have read it have said it's like a thriller. Now, I never even realised that it came over like that. But you know, we've not even mentioned things like some of the witnesses being interrogated and given a hard time. Some of them being given drugs. Tell me about this, and sodium pentothal being injected in the throat, being threatened with their lives. Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, the guy who I had the 4.5-hour transatlantic call, this major witness, he said that he was threatened with his life, taken to an underground facility on Irish Bentwaters under the photo lab. He was given a hard time. He had big burly security policemen, not security police, Air Force officers, Special Investigation, OSI. They were like plainclothes CID detective, and they were giving him a hard time. And he was threatened with his life. And he said, I was a sergeant in the Air Force. I joined the Air Force to protect my country, and now I'm being treated like I was a criminal. And he said he was so scared and offended by what the treatment that he got, that he said afterwards, I felt like going AWOL. Absolutely not.
Yeah. You wouldn't blame him either.
But this is again not that's part of the story that is emphasized in the media. They'll just go into sightings, they'll talk about lighthouses, they'll talk about, oh, could it be in this, could it be in that? They're not really doing the subject proper.
We've got about 4 minutes left, Gary, but there was a question just came up asking you about your movie script. It says, I think I've lost it again now. It says, any more news on your movie script for a true authentic version of the incident? And do you think we will ever see a true version on the big screen?
Well, I'll take the latter bit first. I do think that eventually there will be a huge movie about Rendlesham. It's inevitable. I have been told by people in the film world that the likes of Spielberg are interested in the case and things like that. However, with regards to my script, that's why I had the 7-year collaboration with the Deputy Base Commander, Colonel Holt, because between 2007 and 2014, we worked on that. I wrote the screenplay and he collaborated in evaluating what I'd written for accuracy, etc. Unfortunately, as I got to know Colonel Holt, I realised that he was holding information back from me. And then when he started to attack the original military whistleblower, Larry Warren, and didn't produce the evidence to back it up, I said to him, you're being unprofessional. But if you've got the evidence, fine, put it out there. The evidence falls where it falls. But you've got to produce the evidence. You can't call somebody a liar, a fraud, and whatever, unless you can produce the evidence, because that infers that people have got like a criminal history, which he didn't have. Larry Warren didn't have. And he didn't produce the evidence. So I ended that collaboration after 7 years, and I withdrew the existing film script that I've been working on. I still think now that the film, the problem with Rendlesham in terms of making a big Hollywood movie is the fact that it doesn't have a simple narrative of a major hero. If you think of Star Wars, Harrison Ford, or Raiders of the Lost Ark, Harrison Ford, you have like a central hero. We're talking 4 different shifts. We're talking hundreds of people involved, not just security police. We're talking multiple different shifts. There is no central figure that binds it all together. However, I still do think that eventually it will be made into a movie. And from my point of view, you know, I look at some of the people I've spoken to, like Adrian Bustinza, and I think I would be looking at him as a linking character that says, for some of the nights, some extraordinary things happened, and then you find a way to do it. I still think it will be made into a film inevitably. It's at some point, like Roswell was. There was a very famous TV movie, and that was a very good job. But I think it will be a movie at some point. And I'd love to be involved. But whether it happens, who knows? But
so
I just want to get the truth out there.
So just quickly, so you can get your book. It's available on Amazon. Is that right?
It's
Yeah.
only available on Amazon. It's 500 pages. It's $17.99. You can order it, and it ships within 48 hours.
Brilliant.
It go around the world, whichever Amazon you're on.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us,
Yeah,
Gary. It's been
fascinating
fascinating.
guest.
I wish we had
Fascinating.
more time. So
Maybe we do it again.
An hour and 3/4 have just flown by like that.
Maybe we do it again, eh?
thank you guys for joining us on the Allens Investigate. You can check us out at www.theallensinvestigate.com on Facebook and Instagram. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans and on Roku, of course. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks again, Gary. It's been a pleasure
thank you, Gary.
talking. Bye.
Bye-bye now.